objective of producing 100,000 PhDs in the next decade. It's a big and bold recommendation that they have made, and there are a number of challenges that African universities are facing right now, and it's going to hinder the progress towards this goal, many of these challenges. Without substantial reforms, they will find it challenging to meet this ambitious target. We know that there are a number of constraints. We've talked about them for many years: rigid structures, insufficient resources, inadequate supervision, etc. Many of these challenges become exacerbated by the fact that many students are also not full-time students. There's a whole new debate around the curriculum that is being taught and its colonial histories, and also the weak mentoring systems that sometimes impede academic progress and broader societal transformation. So we know that Prof. Zeleza has done quite a bit of work on this topic. He's extensively examined these challenges. He has focused on issues such as colonial legacies, brain drain, underfunding, the effects of globalization. And so our panel is going to build on these insights of Prof. Zeleza's, and we'll be really setting the context for higher education, looking at both, as I said, the African and US contexts. They will propose what we hope are innovative solutions, I hope, for universities that reflects Africa's cultural and intellectual heritage, so that they once again, and I say once again, become the dynamic engines of knowledge production, driving socioeconomic development, and contribute meaningfully to global scholarship. So we have a panel of experts here. Well, our first presenter is Geoffrey Kimoto. He's at Masinde Muliro University of Science and Technology in Kenya, and his presentation will be on decolonizing knowledge, the transformative impact of Paul Tiyambe Zeleza's scholarship. Then our panel here in person, they're going to answer some questions that I hope will generate some debate amongst the audience as well. So when we have the Q&A session, it's going to be very interactive. So our first, on my immediate left here, is Professor Tawana Kupe. Tawana, Mr. Famous Kupe, as we discovered yesterday. He is a global higher education strategy advisor and the former vice chancellor of the University of Pretoria. He's also the former board chair for the Alliance for African Partnership. Okay, so that's good news maybe for us. And then we have Professor Anthony Wutoh, who is the provost and chief academic officer at Howard University. So 2 down. And then Robert Wamala is the director of research and graduate studies at Makerere University in Uganda. His university is one of the members of the Alliance for African Partnership Consortium. Amy Jamison is my colleague in the office, my twin, as I say sometimes. She's the co-director with me in the Alliance for African Partnership, and she's based at MSU in East Lansing. We do have an office in Malawi, and Richard, unfortunately, is not able to join us today. So it turns out that our virtual speaker is not on right now, so we will start with the in-person, and if he comes on at some point, then we will switch over. But right now, I'm going to have, you're going to stay there and answer your questions. And the first question is that, so the African Union, as I said, has set this goal of producing 100,000 PhDs in Africa over the next decade. What needs to change at the institutional and national levels to realize this vision and strengthen PhD training at African institutions? And we'll ask Prof. Kupe to begin. You do have some limited time. I'm going to monitor you. I hope you'll be good. So Prof. Kupe, please, what do you think needs to change?
A lot. And that is it. So I think it's a good call by the AU to ask for these 100,000 PhDs by 2034. But typical of the AU, which then has implications for the national level, is what is called in higher education an unfunded mandate. They demand all of these things, but no funding has been raised for it. And funding is crucial to graduate training and research in Africa. So that's the problem. Because here is what you need to understand as well, the context of PhDs in Africa, especially if you take the public universities, which are the dominant form of institution that produces PhDs. Only 35% of faculty, as you call it here in America, have a PhD across the continent. And I checked this figure again very recent. So it's only 35% faculty. That means, translate that into supervision capacity. Some institutions have next to no capacity to do that. Second, if you look, not second, but an example, South Africa seems to have the strongest higher education system, 26 public universities, but even there is only 48% across the board, not even 50%. In that same call, the AU, by the way, also asked for an increase of research from 3% contribution to global research productivity to 10%, an improvement in internet capacities, and about 20% of those PhDs should be in STEM. So you do not, if you translate that the AU is made up of member states, you then have to ask the question, what percentage of GDP are you allocating to research funding? It's actually going down. It's not going up. That you find in Prof. Zeleza's work as well. It's decreasing year on year and not increasing. There's also a dependency on donor funding. So the USAID cuts and related cuts from the US, which have now been accompanied by the European cuts, means that there will be even less funding to do that, right? So what is required, therefore, is wholesale systemic change. But before I say so, there's something that's very important, because there's a tendency, as we heard this morning, to say everything is bad in Africa. It's not necessarily true. There are many institutions in Africa and individuals who are very good doctoral trainers. Often they have the following profile. They are active researchers. They are globally connected on the continent and across the world. They are good supervisors. They also work across the globe with their own partners. That should actually be an atmosphere that helps this enterprise. But you are talking about an expression that we use in Southern Africa. We say that is an oasis in a sea of mediocrity. That's the expression that's often used. What we need to do actually is to reverse that situation. That's why I'm saying it should be wholesale systemic change. You can't have oasis in a sea of mediocrity. You need the oasis to be mainstreamed, to become the system, if you like, and funding allowing and all of that. And also that profile of what I call research and graduate cultures, where people are actively researching, they are curious, they are connected, they are linked, they are engaged, and they produce the kind of scholarship and knowledge that will turn Africa's potential into a continent of prosperity. Because it's not that Africa doesn't have the potential, it doesn't have the means. So capacities need to improve, you need to streamline all of those things. Then there is, at the institutional level, systems that ought to change. Because again, often an oasis in a sea of disjointed systems. So I'd normally call this from application to graduation. Many African universities don't have the application and student recruitment systems necessary to sustain a robust postgraduate training institution, especially for PhDs. And you know what that means. You don't recruit without the funding for the students and without the capacity to supervise for the students. Often some do. Students wander around looking for supervisors, looking for funding. And as our moderator said, many students are actually part-time because the context there is people would go to graduate school later in life, they have families, and they're also working. Doesn't cater for that. So systems and processes need to be streamlined with accountability mechanisms at the right places. You don't have the kind of graduate school culture, graduate school systems, levels of accountability. People are appointed to manage, lead, and staff graduate offices as you do in some places. Supervisor training is very important. Many African countries follow the single supervisor model, not the committee system that you find elsewhere. That's very European, that's very British. When the supervisor is one of the members of the OSCCs, that's very good. When they are in the sea of mediocrity, then that is very terrible. So what you then need to do is to really look at that system to say, could you find a different model? And there are multiple models that Africans have used. Co-supervision, sandwich model, that means a student is at MSU for 6 months, then back home for 6 months, perhaps back in MSU for a year, because they are better labs, back home for 6 months, but they have supervisors, they are covered on both sides, and they are funded all of. So there are so very many of these models that the continent could actually adopt. Then, of course, the structure of the programs also need to be addressed. So many African universities run a European system where there's no coursework. You just dive straight into the research with your supervisor, whether they belong to the Oasis Club or to the Mediocrity Club. So you're literally almost on your own. So completion rates are poor. Even dropout rates are very high. So 100,000, if you started with aiming for 100,000, all of the structural things I speak about and the institutional culture issues that I spoke about could reduce that number down. So you need now to rethink the structure of the programs. Could you include some coursework in one fashion or another in these kinds of systems? And this could be done by actually the members of the Oasis Club, doing supervision training for their Mediocrity Club, to connecting across the continent. Part of the problem is that African universities are not connected to each other. African universities meet each other at Howard University or at Harvard University, if you take the H ones, right? And so they don't know each other and they do not work together, even when they are researching the same kind of topics in Africa. Imagine the Oasis Club creating those networks across Africa and bringing in MSU, Howard, and so on. It could actually strengthen the systems. So theory and methods become very important. So often, of course, what is lacking is infrastructure and spaces. Many African scientists, remember, still send their samples to Europe or the US to get them run through, and then they can get the results and write their papers. That includes their PhDs. That also delays the process for a long time. So an investment is needed in the infrastructure and the spaces. Spaces here, we should have doctoral platforms, doctoral conferences, doctoral seminars, and all of those kinds of things on a sustained and long-term basis, also lacking. I already started with I have 1 minute injury time. Funding is also sensitive, it's a very sensitive issue. But there's injury time always. Funding is also very sensitive across all of these things. Last, and now I get off the stage, the African institutions should be differentiated. You have too many institutions that are trying to do everything. Superb undergraduate teaching all the way to graduate teaching in the kind of context that I sketched out for you is not sustainable and will not work. So differentiated universities doing more research and graduate training in robust research cultures, well-funded, will do the continent very well. And in these kinds of contexts, the pursuit of interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary research for transformative societal impact is important. Because it could be very nice to produce all of these PhDs, but if it's not directed in any fashion to Africa's challenges, and that research translating into social impact, you are only hiding to nothing.
Thank you very much, Prof. So the second speaker, Robert Wamala, will also answer that question. Robert, you have 5 minutes.
Wow. Thank you very much. When I think about that question, one particular quote comes to mind, and this is by James Baldwin. And I quote the state, "We can only fix the problems we know exist. Awareness is the first step towards transformation," end of quote. And I don't want to sound a little bit repetitive, but allow me to say that my PhD training in African institutions continues to face a series of formidable challenges, despite the critical role of doctoral education in driving innovations and sustainable development. I know enrollment and completion rates were talked about, but these remain discouragingly low, and many students struggle to progress due to a shortage of qualified supervisors, and that was still mentioned in a way. The research infrastructure was talked about. Compounding these structure issues is the weak alignment between PhD programs and broader national development agendas. Many students find themselves ill-equipped for the evolving demands of the job market, lacking both soft skills and interdisciplinary exposure. There is insufficient funding, which was still talked about. I'm laboring to mention this because they form context for answering the question appropriately. Faculty are overburdened, like in my university, like so many other African universities. They're heavily undergraduate, where the proportion of graduate actually, or postgraduate, becomes really quite small. Mentorship structures are thin, and exposure to global research networks is limited. So without a deliberate policy framework and institutional support, these challenges continue to hold back the continent's potential. And so addressing these issues isn't just a matter of academic reform, it is a necessity for Africa's socio-economic transformation. And to, in a way, respond to the question, because the challenges, in a way, give us a basis for reforms that we need to put in place. I am going to tackle mainly two, because my colleague has actually addressed several of them. I want to talk about the sustainable funding models. And I gave this example just recently. In my university, we're mainly funded by CEDA for our doctoral training. And a time came and CEDA just closed out. And so CEDA asked our government, are you going to take over? And so the key point I'm trying to bring out is governments and universities must prioritize domestic funding schemes for PhD training. Our country actually had to come up with a fund which it gives every financial year, up to $8 million, to basically fund research, and part of that research is used to fund PhD training. So rather than looking outside in the West, we need to look inward and look at what we have available to be able to support this change. Then allow me to talk about the research infrastructure and digital access. There is a lot we have that we can share. And so expanding access to digital libraries, open access journals, and online platforms actually becomes really quite helpful. But I don't have to travel here to maybe access some resources. If these can be made available between institutions, that can be really quite a good thing. In conclusion, we cannot address these challenges from a fragmented solution or short-term fixes. What is needed is a bold, collective commitment to reimagine and strengthen PhD training in Africa. And so let us invest in our institutions, not just infrastructure, but in people. Let us reform our policies, support our supervisors, empower our students. Let us pursue partnerships that are equitable, respectful, and geared towards long-term impact. Above all, let us act because, as a quote reminds us, we can only fix the problems we know exist. And like I did say earlier, awareness is the first step towards addressing this transformation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert. So I think we all know we are all facing this challenge of this change in the geopolitics and the funding landscape. All of our institutions are in trouble, both US and African universities. The full implications, we don't know yet. Is this going to end soon? Is this going to continue for the next 4 years and beyond? But what we do know is that many US universities certainly continue to be mission-driven and focused on promoting knowledge, collaboration, and sustainable development in Africa and beyond. Okay, all right. So my question to the next two speakers, given the shifting global geopolitical environment in higher education, how should US universities sustain their relevance in the global training and research ecosystem? Right now, our partners don't trust the United States. Are there any strategic approaches, so this is part two, are there any strategic approaches that predominantly white institutions like Michigan State University and historically black colleges and universities like Howard University, two R1 universities, by the way. Want to clap that for Howard University. So are there any strategic approaches that these two types of universities should adopt? Amy, let's start with you.
All right, thanks, José. So not surprisingly, for a co-director of an initiative that has the word partnership in the title, my answer will focus on partnerships and the role of partnerships can play in this landscape currently. So with regard to the history of U.S. universities' role in doctoral training of African scholars and African scholars' engagement with our universities here in the U.S., long gone are the days that of the airlift, where we brought African scholars to the U.S. to spend several years on our campuses doing graduate study, graduating with master's and PhD programs, and either presumably going back to their home countries or staying here in U.S. universities. Those students enriched our campuses. I think we can all recognize that. They enriched research, and they went on to become our partners in global engagement and research for our institutions here from the U.S. But this shift has been taking place for quite a long time. I think Prof. Zeleza has recognized this, and it's both positive and negative reasons. So positive reasons are the growing expertise on the African continent with growing graduate programs, and although we are still working on that, and as two previous speakers identified, there has been a significant shift and a growth in that space. There's also been the negative in terms of shifting funding away from supporting higher ed institutions and long-term training in the U.S. For international scholars. This is a funding shift which we all know, it's very obvious, that has expanded exponentially in our current climate. And there are also the acute challenges we're facing now of international students with immigration, visas, issues of freedom of speech that we've seen in the past just 4 months. And now this will have a major impact not on the students that are here now, but also for those that we would be recruiting in the future. As you mentioned, José, from the beginning, that there's a potential loss of trust and people maybe not wanting to come to the U.S. To do their graduate education. And so this is going to have a significant impact on our universities. I think we need to be clear on that in terms of how much international students have contributed to research, to scholarship, and to the growth of our institutions. So how can we look at this current landscape and the needs of the US and the needs in Africa and find mutually beneficial ways of working together in partnership? And we have to note that everyone brings something to the table in this relationship. I think that's a really important thing that we need to recognize from the outset. Are there lessons that we can share across contexts? to help one another. In the 2024 book that José mentioned, Paul Zeleza talks about the African and American academies making the case that the challenges facing higher ed institutions in Africa and the US are not that unique, are not totally separate from one another. So how can we enter these discussions with one another to support each other? And as a side note, I see a very an update to that book that needs to come with just the last 4 months and what's had an impact that's had on the global landscape. So I'm just putting that out there, Paul. But are there joint opportunities such as dual degrees? Prof. Kupe talked about the idea of sandwich programs. We have strong labs, infrastructure here in the U.S. that maybe we could bring students over to enrich our campuses still without needing to stay for long term and having their degrees from their home institutions. There's a supervision crisis that that both of our speakers pointed to that. So this could lead to opportunities for joint supervision, which again enriches our own institutions while also supporting the graduate education of students at their home universities in Africa. The US models that we could look to in terms of the flexibility of a graduate education here in the US that could be adapted to contexts within African universities. I think those are important to explore and how to adapt those to local contexts. The idea of joint publications, the joint production of knowledge across our institutions, I think is really important to highlight so that we understand that there's a mutual benefit here. Even if we're not graduating those students from our institutions, there is a connection amongst our institutions leading to joint research, which then has a broader impact in the academy, but also addressing the issues of global challenges. And I think this contributes to the idea of brain circulation, which Prof. Zeleza has written about extensively, is that we're not focused now these days on brain drain, but there's the opportunity for circulation of knowledge amongst our institution. And I think these partnership models we could explore can contribute to that idea of brain circulation.
Okay, thank you very much, Amy. And now we go to Anthony Wutoh, who's the Provost and Chief Academic Officer at Howard University.
Good afternoon. I would agree with my colleagues and with Amy in framing that really key to this is partnership and collaboration across institutions. Certainly, Howard and other U.S. institutions have resources, have capacity, and can provide a really strong partnership. And the key is that it really has to be an equal partnership. But one of the things that I'll go back to the earlier comments, doctoral education is very expensive. And we really have to revisit the model for training doctoral students, for training PhD students. The models we are employing in the US aren't sustainable. And as we look at institutional resources and really declining support from the state and the federal level, and I think we can only expect that to continue to put pressure on institutions, we really have to consider how do we change the model by which we educate and train doctoral students. And so I would suggest two things. One, we have to make better use of distance learning technologies. And certainly that may be more applicable in the humanities and social sciences than in the basic sciences. But even in the basic sciences and in the STEM fields, I believe we can use better, we can better leverage distance learning models to be able to help underwrite and to decrease the cost of doctoral training. But the other thing, and we had mentioned this earlier, is we're in an information revolution with artificial intelligence. And I think there is an opportunity for us to use artificial intelligence as a tool to help support doctoral training in the West, in the US, in Europe, and certainly in Africa as well. If we look at some of the models, even in elementary schools, in high schools, and certain colleges already, they're using artificial intelligence to help develop individualized tutoring for students. And I think that there's an opportunity for us as well to leverage artificial intelligence, obviously in an ethical way, to be able to augment doctoral training and to provide broader access and wider access with our partner institutions in Africa. So I want us to, while we're not early in AI, because AI has existed for some time, but we are in the early phases of generative AI, and there is great opportunity for us to be able to use that technology to augment and to reframe the way we train and develop doctoral students.
Thank you so much. So that's a topic that I'm sure we'll be coming back to, the issues around AI, etc. So we're going to move on to the next question, and we'll see how we go with time and who will be answering this question. But the next one is, what does a re-envisioned higher education system look like that would enhance both the US and Africa's competitiveness at home and in the global context? So we definitely need to strengthen African universities. We also know that US universities need to continue their own training and would want to be a part of this process. So how do we maintain this? How do we maintain this balance of competitiveness? And I'm going to ask Robert to start.
Thank you very much. I did summarize three things. And number one is a system that is digitally powered and globally connected. You will agree with me that the pandemic revealed the transformative potential of digital education, but also the deep divides that exist and that we actually did see. And so in my particular case, what do I envisage? Number one, a robust digital infrastructure across African campuses to support virtual labs. We may be, there could be distance between us physically, but we are connected. Hybrid classrooms, and of course what you did talk about, AI-driven learning. Joint degree programs, which are talked about by Amy. And then I think lastly for me is the virtual research platforms where African and US scholars collaborate in real time on climate issues, cybersecurity, and so many other research issues. Number two, which is really quite important, a system that responds to local context and global challenges. And in this, I'm looking at encouraging research that is, number one, locally relevant, rooted in African realities, while informed by global standards. And then lastly, on my particular part, is a system that prioritizes equity and access. Now, competitiveness means little if it is not inclusive. A reimagined higher education system must be accessible to all, especially women, probably in the context of Africa, and possibly males in the context of the US, underrepresented communities, and marginalized populations. And so, invest in historically under-resourced institutions, both in the rural and, of course, emerging African institutions. And so, in a nutshell, for me, re-envisioning higher education is not just a luxury. It is a necessity. It is how we prepare our societies to compete, to collaborate, and to confront defining challenges over time. The US and Africa have much to learn from each other and even more to build together. And so a call is, let us commit to designing a system that is innovative, number one, inclusive, globally engaged, and rooted in the beliefs that knowledge is the greatest lever of transformation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Robert. I will now ask Tawana to give his contributions for 5 minutes.
Bless. So I'm going to anchor it on something we spoke I think all four of us spoke about earlier on, partnerships and collaborations. But I want to take a slight turn on it. You see, I think the problem we have now within both the US and also in individual countries in Africa is we have what I call collaboration, partnership and collaboration light. You know, it's not a requirement of the situation. So substantive partnership and collaboration to me means doing much more. It means just moving away from bilaterals or very few institutions collaborating with each other, almost on an accidental basis and organic growth and not a strategic sense. So what we need is really strategic partnerships and collaborations. And those are best carried out through what is called knowledge networks in particular areas. And also we have to get ambitious now, because also it can't just simply be, you know, the United States are classified as part of the global north, and Africa, I say, is part of the global south. And there are many commonalities around the global north. They're normally industrialized economies, and with the stronger economies, if you like, although that can be very relative in the 21st century. In the global south is all of the challenges Robert and I and the colleagues mentioned, and weaker economies. What we need to think about now is those knowledge networks that struggle at continents, not just one or two, not just the United States and Africa. United States is actually one country, Africa is 54 countries. What you need is to have that ambition to create knowledge networks that will include South America and up here to be North America, including Canada, and not just the United States. Then across the African continent, Australia, Asia, and others. And what you do there is you choose very specific area for each knowledge network, because many of the global challenges that are expressed in the Sustainable Development Goals in themselves constitute a research area, which is very large. Imagine if knowledge networks cutting across climate change, across the global north and the global south, across all of those countries, knowing that, as Robert said, there are local dimensions to climate change, and then there are more global conditions. As we know with climate change, the greatest polluters are often the industrialized countries, but the worst effects are felt in the global south, which are not as industrialized, which countries actually still aspire to be industrialized in the old model that the global north has. That's a big societal challenge for everybody. And if you had large researchers, I mean, the group that won the Nobel Prize on climate change was an international, in the sense in which I was speaking about. It wasn't single individual scientists that got the Nobel Prize. It was a climate committee created by scientists around the world. All the challenges that exist today now require that level of scale. Now, with that level of scale as well, we shouldn't leave certain people out of the collaborations. It's not going to be good enough, colleagues, for universities, even in the scheme I'm suggesting now, collaborating among themselves. We are not the only societal actors. You need the governments in there. You need the private sector in there. You need the philanthropic foundations in there. Because the scale I'm talking about cannot be funded by us universities who are suffering from massive budget reductions. I think everybody sitting here from the US and from South Africa has the email about the budget reductions for next year, and it's causing them massive stress and sleepless nights. Now, to be talking about, like I'm talking now, people will be saying, this guy is mad or something. Does he understand my budget cut? But the budget cuts could be addressed now by rethinking the scale of the financing and also taking the challenge to those who should address the challenge. It is not only universities, with due respect. University as a particular entity to deal with society's challenges, but everybody owns the problem if you actually particularly like. So if you like, I'm suggesting that we go away from light collaborations of accidental meetings, the people I like, the people I know, and I'm not saying that good work is not being done there. Again, there are oases, and then there is mediocrity, right? I'm saying that let's be strategic, let's be substantive, let's think about on the scale in which it is needed. I chose climate change deliberately because with climate change, we're out of time for both humanity and our planet. Now, you can't do that on light collaboration and partnership. It's just not actually, you're wasting resources. You have to do it on scale, in real time, and with scaled resources across the globe. And in there, you then put in your doctoral training, all of those kinds of things. But also you raise societal awareness about what's happening. That was less than 5 minutes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So the next speaker will be Anthony, who will give his contributions.
You know, again, the challenges that we're facing are not just local here at Howard or in Washington or in South Africa, and these are global challenges, and they do require thoughtful solutions. One of the things that I was considering is that institutions are mission-driven. And as an institution, Howard has a particular mission. The challenges that we're facing are global, but Howard can't solve every problem, which is why the partnerships, the collaborations, and even this idea of the networks is also important and is going to be critical. I guess the challenge is how do we move from where we are now to a more sustainable, collaborative model where how we have, as an institution, MOUs and partnerships with various African universities in the Caribbean and the South, even in Asia. But to your point, these are oftentimes accidental. You know, I happen to know a colleague at University X, and so we develop a partnership with them. I have expertise in this area, and so I have colleagues in Uganda who are also doing work in this area. So that really the question is, how do we move at scale to a more sustainable model in the context of economic challenge? And that is something that we need brain power across the Atlantic, across the Pacific to consider in a sustainable way. How do we do this across institutions, across nations, across continents? And again, I would have to think that online opportunities, artificial intelligence is going to provide for us a means to consider doing that as a tool that we have not had to this point the opportunity to be able to access.
Okay, Amy?
Okay. Well, José, I feel like they've proposed a big challenge for us in sort of this Alliance for African Partnership model that we are sort of piloting, experimenting with. We've been around since 2016. So the Alliance for African Partnership is a consortium of MSU, 10 African universities, and an ag policy think tank network. And so this is the attempt at a knowledge network. Not specifically, we do have priority areas, but we're focused sort of broadly. And I feel like we're being challenged to think about, okay, how can we take this a little germ of an idea that came about in 2016. We brought together 14 African leaders to kind of co-create what this was going to be, including Professor Zeleza, who was there helping us on this. Prof. Kupe has served on the board. Robert is a focal point for us. But to think about how we work together at this broader scale. We are just a North American institution and several African institutions right now, but how might we expand that in the ways that you're talking about now to support that? We've seen some, in this pilot initiative that we've started, we've seen some success. We've seen some joint publications. We've seen some grant projects come out. We've seen research being done that's innovative, exciting. We've seen capacity strengthening of institutions. But I feel like there's that challenge before us on how do we expand that without moving too fast, without ensuring that we have the buy-in, the partners on board, and that we're not just being, this is a quote that came out of a meeting that we had yesterday with our partners from HBCUs, being strategic and not opportunistic, and that we're not just taking those partnerships that kind of present themselves at our feet, but we're like thinking strategically about how to do this, how to expand. I mean, one thing we've been looking at AAP is expanding to include HBCUs in our network of partners. So we have other partners across the US, African institutions, but how do we expand into Europe, Asia, et cetera, and still do that at a way that we can maintain momentum, not water down what we're doing, but have that impact at scale. So I feel like that is a challenge that's presented to us, José, and with the guidance of you all here. But those types of partnerships, I think, are the way of the future. Those multilateral partnerships working across many institutions, because these challenges are so large, because it's global impact, and also because it's going to take a lot of resources to do this. And we all have resources that we can bring to bear on this, whether they're financial, intellectual, infrastructural, and we also need to band together to advocate for higher education, for research coming out of higher education institutions, for building up graduate education, because I read an article recently talking about higher education as essential infrastructure for a country. Essential infrastructure globally. And so how do we band together to advocate, as Robert was saying, to local governments in our countries, to philanthropic organizations, to say, you need to invest in this essential infrastructure, and it will deliver. So.
Thank you so much. Thank you, colleagues. Thank you very much. Let's give the panelists. I think our meeting yesterday that we had with a number of HBCUs across the United States is kind of like a first step in which we're beginning these conversations about strategic partnerships, and we'll see what happens there and how that unfolds. I know we're doing this at a time when, if this could have happened maybe 2-3 years ago, if we had this conversation, I think we could be like way ahead of the game. But here we are now, and we need to, as you said, advocate for higher education, advocate for funding with our governments and those rich alumni. Howard, you have a whole lot. So right now we're going to go in. So thank you again, panelists. We're going to go in now to our moderated question and answer session. And Isaac Kalumbo, who is the Assistant Director for Outreach at the African Studies Center at Michigan State University, he will take over from here.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. I know you're kind of less energy now after lunch, but I'm hoping that we can be a little bit more lively today. Good afternoon. Okay, so we're going to have the moderated question and answer session at this point, but before we go ahead and do that, I have one question for the panel, which has to do with the fact that from the comments I've heard this afternoon, there was one theme that seemed to resonate, which is that there is need for change in the structure of teaching PhD courses and training PhD students in Africa. And there's been reference to PhD courses themselves, that they lack in many of the programs, that many of the programs aren't doing any courses. It's straight from a bachelor's or a master's and into research without any courses. The other issue is the issue of joint supervision, that the supervision may not be up to standard, and maybe joint supervisions will be a way to solve this problem. However, The question is, how prepared are African universities for these kind of significant changes? Because these changes you are suggesting are major. PhD courses are significant. Also, the idea to collaborate with another university and have somebody from another university having a say on the process becomes complex.
So the thing about it is, like I said, the oasis and the sea of mediocrity is that some of this stuff is already happening, but it's the exception rather than the norm. So it's not as if it will be totally new, if you like, and depending on an institution, some of it might be happening, but it's not, you will not find it as institutionalized policy. I'm not thinking from theory. Mm-hmm. I've been all my life as, you know, a dean of a faculty and all of those kinds of things. You found the way, what you term off the book or informal practices, by very innovative stuff, but it's actually not part of how it is done. Mm-hmm. And so it's the exception rather than the norm, and contributes to the oasis. Mm-hmm. It's mainstreaming those things that need actually to happen. But also it needs a big conversation in the universities themselves. When I heard, in my mind, I was a little surprised when the provost said that you have to rethink doctoral training in the US, because some of our stereotypes is that, no, it's okay there. I know nothing is ever okay anyway in each context. But there is awareness, and even in discussions among academics, people will complain about the existing model. But there isn't, my experience now as a university vice chancellor or president, as you call it, is often the reformers are on the sidelines, if you like, away from people who really want to do innovative stuff. Mm-hmm. That needs to be opened up. There's no better space to open up than in a substantive collaboration with people with different practices. Because the people in a minority in African institutions become a majority, right, because there are other people from around. But as the provost said, you might find that the people who think they are doing very well also need to rethink what they ought to do. So joint supervision also happens, by the way. The sandwich models that I spoke about is often a northern supervisor and a southern supervisor, happening across institutions that have particular grants at particular time. Mm-hmm. As Robert said, that is not sustained. What we need is sustained, mainstream, long-term practices to entrench the change.
Thank you.
Yes, please, I can contribute to that. I actually do agree with you. A lot of this is really quite happening. Allow me to draw reference to Makerere University, where we do offer two kinds of PhDs, PhD by research, and then a taught PhD. Now, all our candidates on a PhD by research do what we call cross-cutting courses that we've set out to basically get these people starting PhD to the same table about research ethics, about data analysis. And so we're doing that already. Then with the supervision, I mean, of course, this happened through CEDA, where we had collaborative supervision from Sweden and then Makerere University. But what we actually came up with was partnership between Makerere University and all private, rather public universities, where we would actually do joint supervision. So this is basically happening, but I think our need is to basically amplify these initiatives.
Thank you, Robert. Please come forward here and ask your questions. Yes, please go ahead.
1, 2, the mic is working.
Yes.
Okay, peace everybody. First, I'll just say thank you to our panelists. I found your comments to be truly amazing. And I found that idea that we should link our higher education more to technocrat-owned and controlled technologies like generative AI and distance learning to be truly insightful. So my question is twofold, and I'm particularly interested in hearing Dr. Wutoh and Dr. Jamison, your answers on this question. The first question is, why should Africans, considering the atrocities that the West has committed and continues to enable on the continent, why should Africans be interested in partnering with the West? And I'll give you bonus points if your answer does not include, because I'm grading, I'll give bonus points if your answer does not include the fact that the West continues to hoard resources based on African wealth and African labor. That's the first question. The second question is, what role does reparations play? And for the purpose of this discussion, I'll define reparations as the unconditional provision of resources for African-led development. What role does reparations play in the knowledge exchange that y'all are describing? Thank you.
I'll actually go back to your first comment regarding technology and the use of artificial intelligence. And what I would argue is AI is a tool. And if we want more control over the way AI is being deployed and the way AI is being utilized, we have to train more African and African American scientists to build the algorithms. We have to be not just users of the technology, we actually need to develop the technology. I see this similar to a car. A car is a car. You can use the car to drive to Miami, to drive locally, to drive to New York, or you can drive off a cliff. It's not the car that is the issue. The issue is the way that the technology is being used. Even once the algorithms are developed, and I'm not a computer scientist or an engineer, but even once the technology, the algorithms are developed, they have to be trained. Much of the data, over 90% of the information on the internet is Eurocentric. The vast majority of websites are Eurocentric websites. It is not the technology that is the challenge. It's the application of the technology and making sure that we are developing scientists, engineers, computer scientists to be a part of and engaged in developing the technology, building the algorithms, and then making sure that the algorithms are trained with data that is not all Eurocentric in design. That's the challenge, and that's the issue. So if we don't get in front of, and the train is already going, as they say, the cow is already out of the barn. But if we don't very quickly make sure that we are developing computer scientists, again, in Africa, in African universities, at African institutions, that we are not supporting the development of entrepreneurs who will be able to use this technology and develop it in ways that will be useful to Africa and to African Americans and other folks of the diaspora. The technology is being deployed. It's being used. And it's going to continue to reinforce biased, racist, you know where I'm going. And so I don't think we can stick our head in the sands and say we're not going to use this technology because it's Eurocentric in design. It's a tool. In the same way a hammer is a tool, a saw is a tool, a nail is a tool, a screwdriver is a tool. It's the use of it and the appropriate application that is going to be critical for it to be meaningful to the futures of African peoples. And so I'll stop there and you can answer the other question.
Yeah. Oh, no, I'll do my best because I think that you raise an important point of why should Africans be interested in partnering with the West? And I think that's critical that we don't take that for granted. We don't take that question for granted. We don't just say, well, the U.S. has all these resources and we have this infrastructure for labs and research, and that's why Africans need to come to the U.S. I think we need to think critically about that. I think we need to flip the script on that. And that's still coming. But thinking about what influence can Africans have in the U.S.? What influence can we learn? What can we learn from that? And how can those relationships, we not take for granted the power dynamics that have been existing for the history of our nation. And so I don't know that I have an answer specifically for that, but I think that examining critically those power dynamics is key. I think that also ensuring that African students, African faculty are empowered to do what they do, to not just look to the West for particular resources, but take advantage of the opportunities that are there in a way that, again, flips that script on the power dynamic. I don't have an answer for you on how to do that, but I think that's an essential question we have to ask in these partnerships. In terms of reparation and knowledge exchange, I don't have an answer for that. I wish that I did. Does anyone want to take up that question?
I may attempt to answer the
Please.
question of why Africans should consider partnering with the West. In academia, we build on what is known. And that's a fact. Without you knowing what is known, then it becomes hard for you to talk about innovations. And so to me, in my view, I think the point should be about academic debates and intellectual engagement rather than the differences in race and color and, you know. What am I trying to say? If a university here has the resources, the infrastructure that I can use to better myself, I mean, I will not stand out and say, no, I will not go to them because maybe this and that happened. I'm looking at a way where, I mean, we can both benefit from each other. You know, I can provide the intellectual capacity that I have, but also benefit from what is available here rather than just looking at only the receiving end. And so we do need each other in this partnership. We do need each other. We can't do without each other.
Thank you, Robert. Professor Kupe?
I partly agree with Robert and partly disagree. But let me just give you my take. I think your question is quite good, and I think Robert was correct that you must also ask the Africans, why do you partner with the West? And that is, you pointed out a problem that exists where Africans have often unthinkingly partnered with the West. Because the West came to them and said, we shall partner with you. And many partnerships and collaborations that exist now were initiated from the global north, were not initiated by Africans themselves. To be quite frank with you, some of them were also opportunistic for Africans without resources, because often the Western researcher came with the funding, and they were the principal investigator. That is a fundamental problem, where the African scientist becomes almost the assistant researcher to the PI holding the fund. And there are two charters now circulating in Europe and Africa questioning that model of doing science. And it's not co-creation. Mm-hmm. The person with the money is the principal investigator. And there's another article, circulating on the internet these days, which people are laughing at very much. It goes something like this. My plane arrives at 5 a.m. Will you please pick me up at the airport? It's an article by a Western researcher or a Northern researcher writing to the African guy to say, yeah, I'm arriving 5 a.m., you pick me up and take me to my hotel. The power relations then. And many people are saying, yeah, that's what I experienced, but I've never been able to say so. So you're quite right to raise those kinds of imbalances. Now, Africans now need to actually critically think about, if a person comes with a bag of money and says, I will be the PI, I will be assistant researcher, it's difficult when you don't have money, you want to do the science. But I think it's time now you actually say no. Or say, okay, fine, you have it, but let's rethink the whole idea. Why can I not be a co-PI? And also some people are beginning to do that. So there has to be that, a rethinking the model, if you like, in Africans also. The second thing is difficult to make this because it's fine to speak like this because it sounds all theoretical. One of the things that worried me when I was university president or vice chancellor was exactly that, why do Africans not start knowledge networks? Because I had ambassador after ambassador, Western researchers come to see me, want to partner with you, you think you are doing good things. Then I say to my team and other vice chancellors in Africa, let's start knowledge networks and invite the northern guys. So the first one I started with was something which exists now, called the South Africa-Canada University Network. This Canadian ambassador was telling me, look, you guys should, part of my performance contract is educational linkages. I said, no, I can't work for you, for your ambassador's contract. What I want us to do is, I want us to create a South Africa-Canada University Network, and the name must be in that order. South Africa first, then Canada. So I took all of my 26 public university colleagues to Toronto in 2022 or 2023, and we had an agenda, and we met with the universities Canada. But one of the things I did was that it would be dangerous to do this. I suggest this, but I then say, but Canadians must fund this. We don't have the money. So I went to our National Research Foundation. They gave me money, surprisingly. And so I went to Canada with the idea and some money. And then I said, can we mobilize the science councils in Canada, visited all of them, and in South Africa to contribute to this? I think this week they are meeting in South Africa as well to take that agenda forward. Because then I saw it's an African need driven by Africans, but bringing in partners in the global north, but not as messiahs of knowledge, as people who are going to co-create knowledge together, including questioning what they are doing. Because we haven't spoken here about indigenous knowledge systems. I think in the previous sessions in the morning, some people alluded to it. Africans have something to bring to the table, which would question Western science or Western notions of science. Yes. So I think that your question is really brilliant in that regard. So what we then need to do, and then Africans should say, no, we want also the Caribbeans, the South Americans, and the Asians, us in the global South together with you. My South Africa-Canada thing, I told the Canadians, next level of movement should be North Africa, and not just South Africa, but the rest of the African continent.
Thank you, Professor Kupe. So clearly there are ways to respond to this problem, and it's really located in a flipping of the script and in a flipping of the way we are thinking about these collaborations, and to subvert the notion of the superior versus the inferior, to subvert the notion of the moneyed and the moneyless, but to say we have capacity as we stand, and we are to be respected like everybody else, and then try to expand that. You have some comments?
Yeah, I just had something to add to that in terms of thinking of what a resource is.
Yeah.
What is the resource that everyone brings to the table?
Yes.
And it can't be this narrow definition of a resource being money.
Right.
That there has to be a really reconceptualization of what is valuable.
Yes.
And what is valuable that people bring to the table. And we need to push that. I mean, we have to bring that to the table and say, it's not just, we're not just going to have you there as like a number that looks good for us in the US. Like, you bring something to the table that we could not get anywhere else.
Yeah.
And that is valuable. And you know, and we bring something that you also can not get anywhere else. And that is valuable, but it can't be this very narrow definition.
Thank you. I think we need to move on to Professor Bookman's question.
Yeah, I almost started to walk away because the conversation has evolved into what I was going to put on the table. A part of that for me has been some of the wonderful conversations that I've had outside of the presentations about what is it of African value and culture and history that is part of what is happening in the academy. And so my question was really asking about the challenges of curriculum, not necessarily at the PhD level, but at the level of connecting all of what is done in the academy to what is real in the lives of the people who we are supposed to be serving when we come out of these institutions. And I was very struck by the conversation about Ubuntu this morning, what it means and how that relates to all of what is happening in both the academy and in society in general. And I was struck by the wording of Audre Lorde, and that is that the master's tools can never be used to dismantle the house that master built. And so my question was really going to be the challenges that are faced in all of our institutions when we try to bring an Afrocentric knowledge base to the learning that we're doing and to what we then do with that knowledge base to go out into our communities to make the lives of the people in our areas better. And I know that we are sometimes stuck in the curriculum, because it does have very often a Eurocentric base. But I think if we're really going to make movements in some of what I heard this morning in terms of the Renaissance of Africa, Pan-Africanism, it's going to have to take a very different balance in terms of these exchanges that we're talking about. So I make just a comment on what you've said, but I think you all have already addressed it very extensively. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Bookman. We'll take 2 more questions and then answer them in.
Well, it's not a question I have, it's a suggestion. This conversation reminds me of an event I was at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce 2 years ago about the reskilling of talents and of American workers. And there were several new educational entrepreneurs, which when they were doing it, when they get known, they're going to subvert the U.S. higher education, which I've been advocating since I came to this country in 1967. It's too wasteful. What they're trying to do is that they cut short and they work with the employers, industry and things like that. So they caution the education to meet those needs now and in the future, which the universities are irrelevant when they produce people here and in Africa. So
Thank you.
If you could check with the Chamber of Commerce to get that exact event, it would be useful to all of you.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Malete?
I really appreciate something that Robert mentioned, which is locally relevant solutions and how do we create that. And I want to add to the comment that the Prof just made, just to ask Prof Kupe, from your example working in the South African context, you know, what are some of the things that you have seen that you think we can learn from in terms of the interface of higher education and industry? Because South Africa has been a little bit more successful, and the example you gave with the initiative between South African, University of Pretoria and Canada, I think there's something to be learned there, because there's a challenge where private sector doesn't engage as much as it's supposed to. And I feel like private sector in Africa wants to reap where it doesn't actually sow. So how do we, what examples can we learn from that context in terms of enhancing a stronger interface between university, higher education, the private sector, the communities, in terms of creating what you might call locally grown, locally relevant solutions that are Afrocentric in nature and agenda setting?
Thank you. At the risk of too many questions, we'll have Professor Mpim, and then we will go to the answers. I hope that's not too many for my panelists.
Good job. Good job, panel. But my question goes to Professor Kupe. When you were talking about the mission of the AU, the goal to train 100 PhDs by a certain period, you made a comment about the universities must identify themselves. And I'm not sure, you said universities should identify themselves. I'm not so sure what that meant. So if you could speak to that. Because you talked about most of the universities being teaching universities and graduates, you know, schools being small numbers, and then you said universities must identify themselves. So how?
Differentiate themselves.
Differentiate, okay, well. So what does that really mean, and how will that, you know, contribute to the solution?
Thank you, Professor Mpim. A number of questions there, please.
Yeah, so I think perhaps we should just have dinner. Yes, José. That's why I'm saying we should have dinner to answer his big question. But I'll give you a rapid example. So those of you who have been, especially the AA people who have been to University of Pretoria, we know there's a fantastic campus that is called Future Africa. It's all made of wood. All of the buildings are made of wood, which is sustainable, you know, climate-friendly material. I found that when I became president of Vice Chancellor, I found it had been built. Then in asking a little further, it turned out that the wood was imported from Finland. It's called structured engineered wood. But there's a lot of wood on the African continent, including in South Africa itself. So when alumnus came, I used to take alumnus around because I was wanting money for them to. The thing had been built for 10 million. I wanted 10 million back. I wouldn't have used university money to build it. I would have used external money. So I wanted the money back. So I wanted alumni to come. So this alumnus comes and he starts crying. I said, but I'm sorry, did I say something offensive? He said, no. Why did you import the wood from Finland? I run a timber company, and I'm a CEO of a timber company. We could have done this here. I said, wait a minute, it's not just cutting down the trees. It's called structured engineered wood. There's a science behind it, which we have not yet done. But let's do this. Will you give me an endowed chair in order for us to produce structured engineered wood and to use it for at least 3 purposes? Build affordable housing for people who in the lower economic income, and also to do a demonstration building for one of my buildings in the university. As we speak right now, the guy gave me the endowed chair, and he's running, right? And as we speak right now, they're doing the research, and that is what is going to happen. So I wanted to intersect into the housing market, because those houses will be cheaper and more sustainable, or more suitable for the, as you know, our climate in Southern Africa, not these wood, asbestos structures, if you like. So it's going, unfortunately, he then asked me to come and visit the timber place. I went and saw him. We signed the agreement. Some of you have seen me wearing one black jacket all the time. If you look carefully, there's written York Timbers. I wear it all the time. But the guy unfortunately died of COVID, during COVID. So, but the next CEO, I made sure, committed to the long-term project, and it's going on. So I hope LEPSI satisfies you. So it was private sector, university, 2 purposes to actually increase housing stock. As you know, housing stock, including here in the US, is unaffordable for common people. So I hope that was fast enough and said, but we can talk more about other examples. Now, the differentiation, my colleague, what I meant is that if you look at many African universities, because they are colonial inheritances, they were actually designed for undergraduate training. Postgraduate training was an add-on later on, post-independence, but that did not last because the politicians were interested in massifying undergraduate training because it has greater political benefits. They didn't do that only. They built more universities which are undergraduate. So graduate training in Africa has always been a sideline. Most people who were done graduate training, my age, Prof. Zeleza's age, labs and so on, we all came to the north. In fact, even your undergrad teacher will tell you, you are very bright, go abroad. So don't stay here when he could supervise you. So therefore, there is all of the things I spoke about earlier are lacking. What we need to do now is to have some universities that are more inclined for proper quality, high-level, contextually relevant graduate training in the African context. Others doing undergraduate training. Like you have in the US liberal arts colleges that don't do graduate training.
Right.
People go elsewhere to do graduate training.
So some specialization.
Yeah, José said, I'll cut your throat, so I'll stop.
Yes, so I'm going to call on our Associate Provost for University Outreach and Engagement, Professor Kwesi Brookins, to take over.
I'm not as tall. I'm going to do something because we are at time, actually we are beyond time. And I'm going to do something that most PhD trained people don't do, particularly professors who like being up and talking. And that is to say that everything has been said. I have nothing else to add. Enjoy your afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you, panelists. Let's give them a round of applause. And let's give our Associate Provost a round of applause. Thank you, everybody. Have a good evening.
Thank you. It was great fun.
That was fun.
to the next session.